Welcome everyone to the FloridaMan 40K podcast. I don't even remember what episode number this is. That's okay, we're just going to dive right in. Both John and myself have had a very busy week and a half. Mine kind of good. I had a birthday, I was doing birthday things. John, I know your week wasn't necessarily awesome the entire week because you had some car trouble, but besides that, did you have a good, break from the podcast?
Yeah, I had a pretty good week overall, leading into episode 8, and I did unfortunately have some car trouble, which is currently being resolved, so we will see what those costs end up being and how they affect my future tournament plans. Hopefully the engine repair is not as expensive as it could be, and if it's not, $1,000, then I'll still go to SoCal.
Yeah, which I'm hoping you can go to SoCal because we need as many Florida players to represent. Because apparently, I guess Brohammer still just isn't a good enough club to get mentioned.
Yeah, we're starting to get it. Mostly Siegler.
Yeah, Siegler's gotten a lot of attention.
Yeah,
pretty much just Siegler.
All right.
But anyways, he's one of ours, so I will take it.
Yep. And let's get rolling. So what are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so enough rambling. Basically, I have a really cool topic that I like, something I've been practicing a lot. It's basically your passive thinking when you go into a game versus active decision making. So when you practice a lot, most of the time it's a good thing, but you get into basically you're moving off of reaction. You're not actively making every single decision. You kind of have a game plan that you go into any game when you've practiced a list. Like John, you with Gene Stealer called as a perfect example. For the most part, you're just going to place your blips. You're going to put units that you know can survive, or characters, you're going to hide them, put them in cover, whatever. You kind of have the same game plan for your first two turns, which 9 times out of 10 is great. But sometimes they'll get you into trouble because you're playing against an opponent maybe you're less practiced against. They have some tricks that they can do, or they're just a really good opponent. So your normal tricks aren't necessarily going to work the same way. And that's where you get into the active thought, which is where you're actively making decisions to try to better your opponent, do something that's maybe out of the ordinary, not what most people would see as the best play. A good example of this was you throwing the Orions at Nick Nanavati. Everyone was looking at that as like, what is he doing? That is a terrible decision. Well, it looks like a bad decision, but you actively thought and made the decision to do this to get a different result because you knew if you both played kind of the passive game you both have practiced, you already knew what the result was going to be. So that's kind of like the quick summary, but there's a lot more to it than just that.
Yeah,
you got anything?
Even I consider myself a very well-practiced Gene Stealer. I absolutely do lapse into passive thought where I am just doing the exact same thing I always do and assuming that my opponent won't be able to stop it. One of my losses at Nova to Brad Chester, I would actually pretty much directly attribute to me being in passive thought and not going into active thought quickly enough. In that game, he was playing an orc list with a lot of grots and a lot of shooting, and I had no practice against that, and I just kind of passively went into that like it was an orc game, and it was a very different orc list that played very differently, and I lost that one, unfortunately. But, looking back on that in hindsight, I can recognize that I kind of relied on my experience too much and didn't really sit down, take a couple minutes, and think about what was going to go differently in this one.
Yeah, and that's a great example of, I'm trying to think of the right word. It's not like, it's confidence, I guess is a word, where you've practiced, you have confidence going into a match, and sometimes that can be what leads to your downfall. And even in so much as where I do it a lot, is I will do my movement, psychic, shooting, blah, 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 blah. I get into the charge phase, I charge with my first unit, and then it's like, hey, I made the charge, I'm going to go ahead and declare, blah, 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 start attacking. I rolled dice, I'm like, I didn't charge the other 2 units. Like, you get into one mode, okay, I charge, I'm going to attack. When you get into that mode, you have the issue of getting ahead of yourself, essentially. So that's just another thing where you need to take time, slow down, and actively check the game state. In Magic the Gathering, this is actually incredibly relevant, and this is kind of the example and why it came up with me was I was actually looking into Star Wars Legion, which has some similar interactions, I'll say. But Magic the Gathering, Star Wars, 40K, all these games, you have a game state and phases. So in Magic, you have the beginning of the turn, you actually have upkeep. You untap your cards, you have an upkeep, and then you draw. So many people, it's their turn, they just immediately draw. Well, they missed 2 whole phases of the game. So when I was playing Magic competitively, I always had a little mantra in my head, untap, upkeep, draw. You kind of need to do the same thing in 40K to keep yourself out of making those mistakes. So what I've gotten into personally is in the movement phase, I start on the left side of the board, and I go every single unit. Did I move them? Yes, 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 all the way through the entire army. Okay, now in the psychic phase, and literally do this in your head, say, okay, movement, psychic, okay, what do I need to do? And when you're playing a chaos army, and you have rerolls you need to consider, you have to prioritize powers, you have buffs, debuffs, and then damaging spells is usually the order you want to go. Well, kind of the same thing. Did I cast all my buffs? Okay, now I can move on to the debuffs. Make sure I get those going for me. And every single turn, just get into that trained mode of actively thinking about the game so that you don't make a passive mistake. Like passing on your psychic phase because you just got all these smites off, you killed this unit, now you got out of combat, you can now shoot with a unit that was locked down previously. Well, guess what? You forgot to cast Miasma of Pestilence, and now your Plague Bearer's gone, you just lost the game. So I'm being a little bit wordy and giving a lot of examples, but it's one of those concepts that really comes down to, for me at least, just identifying mistakes and trying to work through them and correct yourself so you don't make those same mistakes again.
Yep, and I would call it not letting yourself get too familiar. Well, I think there's there might be a saying about this that I'm blanking on, but essentially, if you become too familiar with your army, you might assume that you're doing it correctly, and if you just autopilot, you can lose. And again, that's the example I gave with one of the games I lost at Nova, my game 5. But really, if you just sometimes you have to stop and think. And also, what army you're playing really actually plays a large part in this, because some armies you may not feel like you have time to stop and think. Genestealer Occult Orcs, Chaos Hordes, any army where you're very likely to run out of time, you may only go on passive thought. And that was really what happened with me, was I was thinking, okay, we're playing Orcs versus Genestealer Occult here. We both have, we have a sum total of maybe 350, 400 models on the board. I'm going to have to go fast, and I kind of just autopiloted my way through the first couple turns before I realized that I was very much so playing it incorrectly.
Another thing that I personally have kind of noticed and seen is making the mistake, even with low model count armies. You think, I've only got 6 things, it's not going to take that much effort, just do this real fast, blah, 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 I'm done. But you got to pace yourself, understand I have an hour and a half on my clock. That means I have so many minutes per turn, so you kind of check the clock and make sure you're staying on pace. But I guess the ideal situation would be to almost have a breakdown in minutes for every phase, and okay, check this off at the 5-minute mark, check this off at the 10-minute mark. Make sure you're hitting all your little benchmarks, and that takes a lot of practice to plan your turns out that in depth and that efficiently. But that's kind of almost what you need to get to really break this habit.
Yeah. And what I do to kind of keep myself straight in that regards and make sure that I am going through everything is I narrate the end of every phase very clearly. Sometimes people laugh at me because I play an army without Psychers at a certain point. And I go into it like my Custodians, and I finish my movement phase, I say end of movement phase. I stare at the table for a second, and I say, okay, end of psychic phase. And then I keep going, and everyone laughs as if I'm making a joke. No, this is me just going through my pattern.
One thing, just kind of in general, and I don't know if you touched on this or not, but sometimes with the passive thought is you're drawing on past experiences. So when you're very practiced with an army, for instance, when I'm using the Thousand Suns battery, I expect to get so many mortal wounds in a given psychic phase. I have 4 characters. They're all casting 2 damaging spells per turn. They average 2 mortal wounds per spell with like 1 failure. Most of the time, my opponents don't deny. So I'm used to a certain result. So I'll set myself up thinking and expecting, oh yeah, I'll get 10 mortal wounds. I'll drop that Riptide. We'll be good to go. But then the variance hits, and you didn't put yourself in the best position to recover from that because, well, in the past it's always worked. So why didn't it work this time? So that's where you kind of need to stay on top of your game and always have a contingency, and don't just let past experiences dictate your decisions.
Yeah, it's definitely easy to get into a rhythm and then assume that something will continue to happen. I've lost games on assuming that, my acolytes have made every 5-inch rerollable charge I've ever asked them to. They'll make this one too. Is it likely? Sure. Will it happen once every 30 or 40 games? Yes. Did that game happen at a major? Yeah. So definitely that's an easy thing to get into a pattern of and make the mistake of. With that said, I do want to emphasize that you should not always be in active thought. So I kind of do want to cover like the benefits and downsides of both aspects, and then kind of when you should use each. So the way I see it is that, just like, an intense workout, 40K is draining. Playing 40K is difficult, depending on how much you ate, your mental health, how much you slept, how old you are. It can be more or less draining, how many models you have, etc. And people consider that, but how hard you're thinking for a given army really does matter. Genestealer Cult, I can usually play with passive thought. It's really when it gets me in trouble is when I don't realize that I need to switch to active thought. So passive thought you should usually use when you're facing something you've faced multiple times. So for example, if I'm playing against a 4-knight list with 2 Armigers, I can go into passive thought pretty safely because I know what that list is going to do. And, I can rely on my past experience to carry through it. I've made the right decisions before. I know what the right decisions are. I don't need to really tax myself thinking, okay, what is he going to do? What am I going to do? How do I get myself out of this? Etc. And that will preserve kind of my energy for later in the tournament for that next round when I'm playing against, Harlequin bikes and grotesques and witches and Yanari characters and a bunch of weird stuff that I've never seen before. That requires a lot of active thought because it's an army I'm not familiar with. But anytime I'm in a very familiar situation, passive thought will usually kind of carry me through it and will keep me from getting tired or from taking too long thinking. Because again, I'm playing Genestealer Cult, I cannot afford to start every turn with 5 minutes of walking around and measuring, hemming and hawing, and asking my opponent questions. I maybe do that for 1 turn a game at most.
Yeah, and you actually brought up a good point, and I'll kind of go on a tangent for a little bit. But mental fatigue is something a lot of people underestimate in 40K. Unless you're going into an Iron Man, you kind of expect it rounds 4 and 5, which is also usually your toughest opponents if you're doing well. So that's where passive thought is incredibly useful, is if you are just worn out, then you can tend to play well and perform well without actively thinking. However, to avoid even getting into a situation like that, it is important to get rest. I know, like for me, I love going to these tournaments, drinking, hanging with the guys, staying up late, watching movies, talking between day 1 and 2. But at the same time, if you are in a position where you can contend to win the whole thing, and if that's what's important to you, it might be a good decision to maybe not drink so much, get some rest, make sure you eat a good breakfast. I mean, it almost goes without saying, but it kind of also needs to be said because, like, I know I don't do that. I'm having a good time. I'm hanging out with the guys, and that absolutely affects your day too. If you go in hungover, not feeling well, you're facing a top 10 player, top 20 player, whatever. They're prepared for your army. They've thought about it the night before. They know what the matchup is going to be. They've got a plan for you. And even if your list has the advantage, if they've come up with a plan to play against your weakness and they know what you're going to do essentially, then you can win a game on paper your list should lose, or vice versa. So that's just something to be careful of. Is kind of take care of yourself. Make sure you're mentally in the best position to perform well, because I mean, you don't do well when you're exhausted. You just, unless that's how you literally practice, and your entire life you just are worn out and hungover for everything, then maybe you'll do better. But that's not everyone. That's like Cass, and maybe that's about it.
I won't take any attacks on any of my friends here, but
oh, that's not an attack. That's a sign of love.
Oh, I thought you were about to say that it wasn't a friend. So anyway, more what I'm thinking is, yeah, you have to be prepared for these events by having some things planned out. That's why I spend a lot of time theory crafting, is so that I'm not using active thought at the table. So if I'm stopping and coming up with my plan mid-game, that is going to take a while, and it does require a lot of effort. And if I have to do that 9 games in a row, round of 9, I'm gonna be asleep. Like, I will not be participating at that table. So you kind of have to think of this when you're building your list. Is this an army that can change a lot? We call it jank. But if you have an army that can do a lot in game and can adjust its plan a lot, that army will require a lot of active thought, unless you have had 100 practice games with it, which Gene Stealer Cult, I did get to that point where I hit over 100 games with the Codex, and I was using it relatively well. Making good decisions almost all the time. Even so, I had a game where it caught up with me, I messed up, and I lost because of those mistakes. But if you have something like a night game or a night army, they've got some tricks, but knights don't have as much jank or as many options in game as Gene Stealer Cult. That's just an obvious sentence because it's 200 models versus 6. That kind of army, you can probably get into more active thought because you're thinking about each model and it's not taking up too much time. But especially, I don't think you have to plan ahead as much if you're playing a night army.
Yeah, and to kind of piggyback off of that, night players usually make most of their decisions pre-game in relics, warlord traits, picking the right secondaries, things like that, and then you kind of go on to autopilot passive thought, like turns 2 through 5, and then did I survive? Okay, now turn 6, I got to make the decisions to make sure I get the right points to close the game out. And that's not to talk down to night players or say that they're not playing the same game, but where they're making their decisions is in a different spot than Gene Stealer Cult. Gene Stealer Cult, you're making most of your decisions, I'd say turn 2 and 3, and then a lot on turns 5 and 6. I know every turn's important, but you have your kind of initial wave to take out your opponent's assets, and then you have your consistent end game waves to make sure you're holding objectives and scoring the points you need to score. Where knights, you got 6 models, you put them on as many objectives as you can, and you kill as many things as you can. Like that's the long and short of it.
Really changes. Yeah, I absolutely agree with what you're saying there. And then, do you have any specific examples of when you want to use active thought or passive thought? Pardon me, because it feels like we've kind of been poo-pooing passive thought as being, oh, that's how you make mistakes and lose. What do you think about like when should you?
Yeah, so that's a very good point, and again, because part of it is conserving your mental energy and not wasting time trying to make too many decisions. Like at the end of the day, 80% of your games should be kind of similar when you have a strategy built into your list. So a good example of this for me is the Lord Discordance Mortarion list, a Disco Rush. Mm-hmm. My turn 1 is pretty much always passive thought. I'm going to be advancing my Plague Bearers as far forward as they can get. I'm going to be moving Mortarion up, familiaring him to get warp time, doing everything I can to get that warp time off, advancing the Lord Discordance. Just rush as far forward as you can, take out as many assets as you can turn 1. So kind of turns 1 through 3, the only active decision you're making is identifying threats, and that's it. Like the rest is pretty much you're doing the same thing. Get as much board control as you can early and just rush. That's the name. So something like that, you have there's not really any variance. If you hold your Lord Discordants back, they're going to get shot, and they're not going to do their job. You don't really have to make that decision. I mean, there's going to be corner cases, there's going to be armies where you don't want to do that, but 9 times out of 10, your game plan's the exact same. So that's just a specific example of you don't overcomplicate it. Knights, don't overcomplicate it. I mean, even with like orcs, you want to make sure that you are very particular in your deployment, so your looters are in a good position to get garrote shields, get good line of sight, get as much cover as they can, outrange your opponents. But after that, you pick a target, you make sure you get a decent number of shots, you're going to shoot with your looters. Like, we're not reinventing the wheel every single phase. So I guess, honestly, passive thought is usually fine. Movement phase, shooting phase, sometimes even the assault phase, as long as you just take that moment to say, like, is there any wild thing that I'm not expecting? As long as that's a no, like, so you want to always still check. That's kind of my thing, is get into the habit of checking game state consistently. But most of the time, okay, this is what I expected, just roll with it. And that's where, I guess, what it comes down to is make the decision to think actively or passively at the beginning of each phase. And I know that's, again, a little bit counterintuitive, but you're just checking, see if you're good. Okay, if I'm good, proceed as normal. If you get into that's an unusual circumstance, that's when you need to really reevaluate and get into actively making decisions for every single thing you do that phase.
Yep. And you do have to allocate your clock a little bit here. At this point, with the way ATC is going, I think most competitive games you can plan on being on the clock. Think about what turns are going to matter the most and prioritize those turns. If you're playing against Gene Stealer Cult, prioritize your whatever turns are leading into their turns 2 and 3, because those are the 2 turns where they're most likely to hit you, and those are the ones that you know that there are hammers coming, and you really have to spend your time on those turns, making sure that you're not setting up some exploitable weakness that will just cost you the game immediately, because Gene Stealer Cult can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I had another example, but I just lost it. So if you got more, keep going. I'll try to think of it.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll come back to you in a second. Other things on passive versus active thought. Really, it's I think what you said before was right. You need to kind of take just a quick 15 seconds before every phase, sometimes even less, sometimes it's obvious, and just think, all right, is there something else I need to do? Is there something unusual here, something out of the normal? Like, maybe you're used to charging into things and wrapping. You need to look, all right, is there a counterpunch unit that, the last AdMech player I played didn't have? So you may think, okay, my opponent has their Skitarii Rangers out front, I'm going to send my Gene Stealers in and wrap them. You did that once and you tabled the guy. This is a great plan. Obviously, it's going to work. Take 10 seconds and look at his army and say, okay, is that 10 Electro Priests in a drill right behind the Rangers? Maybe you don't follow the old plan. Maybe you have to look and think, and you see that and you think, okay, as long as that threat is there, I still have to take my time and actually think through every decision, not just autopilot into him.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think what I was going to say is you kind of want to set yourself up to be as lazy as possible, which sounds bad to start, but make the difficult decisions early so that way the turn plays out. Like I even mentioned in the psychic phase, I start with my buffs, then my debuffs, then my damaging spells most of the time. Because if my buff failed on a certain unit, well, now I know that my priority has shifted. Now I've got to make an active decision and change what I'm doing. Mm-hmm. But that psychic phase starts out the same way for me. I'm going to start with Miasma of Pestilence. I'm going to start with my reroll spell and then Miasma of Pestilence. Like I'm doing the same thing to start every psychic phase, but then I adjust based on did I get the result I needed or not. So that's kind of the example of set yourself up to know how long can I go with my normal pattern, my normal plan, okay, my normal plan failed here. Now I can adjust course and change course. And that kind of goes into having a game plan overall. The worst thing you can do in 40K is just go to the table and say, I have no idea what I'm going to do. Let's win this game. That you're setting yourself up for failure.
And I'm going to piggyback off of that now because it sparks an idea for me. The other part of passive thought versus active thought that I enjoy is get as much active thought out of the way before the game as possible. So practice obviously pays dividends. Planning things out if you haven't, if you don't have experience against a matchup. So for example, you may be going to the SoCal Open and you may be thinking, all right, I haven't had a lot of time to practice against these new Space Marines. Okay, that's fine, but you need a plan for Space Marines because you don't want to be running that entire game on active thought. Because if you are, then you're going to be burnt out and you're going to start to make mistakes as you get a little foggy and you start to take too long, especially, and then you get rushed and then you make more mistakes and then you lose the game. Go watch a battle report. The Best in Faction podcast is doing a couple on there every Wednesday night. They're live streaming a game that has so far will be including Space Marines for the next couple weeks. Go watch some of those. Put it on while you paint. Go talk to Space Marine players. Go, even something as lowly as competitive 40K can still help you out. Go find a Space Marine player. Shoot me a PM right after you like this podcast. Yeah, anything you can do to get some thoughts in ahead of time will absolutely help you out because you don't have to spend the time and the effort on it in game. So if you just look at the Iron Hand repulsor list and you can think, oh my god, this thing is terrible, only a cheesy douchebag would run this, that's great. That doesn't help. Think, how am I going to deploy against this? If you just think, I'm just going to lose against it, then you get to the table, realize you actually do want to win, and spend 30 minutes on deployment, well, that's on your clock. Now you're going to be playing the rest of the game at light speed, and you will probably make mistakes and get punished horribly because of that list.
Yeah, so that actually ties in perfectly with the other thing I was going to say, which is kind of comes back to a game plan. How are you going to win the game? So a big thing that we talk about is, making the active decisions in game to make sure you don't miss a trigger, miss a step, end of the movement phase, beginning of this phase, blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, you need to have a plan for victory. And don't just passively go along with that plan and then on turn 6 check the scorecard and say, oh, I'm down by 18 points? I didn't realize that. I guess I lose. Make sure you're not just paying attention to the game itself. Make sure you're paying attention to the score. And if your game plan isn't working, make the decision and change it. I got to go back to my game with Tim, and it's in the one GT I won, so Lena's going to give me trouble about talking about that stupid GT. But probably the biggest thing I learned was I was playing against Tim and his Tau, and I started out, I deployed obliterators, I deployed all my assets to just go all in, break his castle, take the game over. Except my first shooting phase whiffed, my first psychic phase whiffed. He's got his entire castle. I don't even think I got kill one on turn 1. And the retaliation cost me my obliterators. It cost me like 30 plague bearers. I basically had nothing. So it's like, well, if that plan didn't work, oh, here's this giant ruin. I have terminators that can get out of line of sight. He's got to move to shoot me. I'm Alpha Legion. Suddenly he's hitting me on 7s. So I took just a couple minutes, looked at the table, and was like, oh, here's my out. This is my avenue to win a game that I should now lose because of the decisions I made did not pan out. If I followed on that same path of I'm just going to try to throw stuff at the castle until it breaks and touches broadsides, if I kept doing that path, I'm losing that game. It's not even close. Instead, I'm like, this is not going to work. I have to make a different decision. I have to have a different game plan. How can I attack this differently? And I made that decision early, and then Tim didn't quite catch on until I think turn 4, which only gave him about 2 turns to truly react. And at that point, I had gotten a good enough lead. I was able to squeak out like a 2-point win. It was super close, and if I would have just stuck with the original game plan, he crushes me. And then instead of me getting to talk about my one GT win and getting crap from Lennon, I got nothing.
I won't give you crap for that. It was still well earned, and obviously it was a very wonderful event, not a stupid event. Wonderful event. Battle
says the TO.
And No, I agree. You absolutely. Anytime your preconceived plan starts to change, or the situation you're envisioning starts to change, take a step back and think, all right, is this still the right call? Like, do I need to switch, my preconceived plan, my autopilot? Is my autopilot taking me in the wrong direction? Do I need to just stop, reverse, and change everything? And, you got to make that call sometimes. And, the more you do that, the more you practice changing in game, the better you'll get at it. The more skills you will earn and learn, etc.
Alrighty, so what we're going to discuss next can either be the super overwhelming and game-changing FAQ, or we can discuss the little successor chapter thing in the Marine book. It's not a big deal. Whichever one you want to talk about, John, totally cool with me.
All right, I think I'm going to lean into FAQ. I'm going to save the chapter tactic talk for the second part of next week's episode, which will be a preview of the Crucible Major and a lot of Space Marine talk. Wink, wink. So let's hop back into this FAQ. So much hyped as always, not as much lamented because no one was really complaining about it. Games Workshop did drop their FAQ last Friday, but they also sneakily dropped it on Monday as well by updating a couple of things afterwards. So make sure you go catch up on that. There were not a ton of fundamental changes to the game. However, there were a couple. As far as the main rulebook goes, the only real FAQ that mattered was that they addressed how rerolls work, and that is that if you are rerolling one or more dice, that decision is made all at the same time. So, for example, if you have a 2d6 charge, and you have Here We Go from Orcs, which lets you reroll one or both die, and you have a command point reroll, you cannot do that one at a time. You have to decide before you reroll anything what rerolls you are using. So an old tactic, which was perfectly viable, was you have 2d6, you use Here We Go to reroll one of them, see if you make the charge, then use a command point to reroll the other if you still didn't make the charge, and see if that gets you in. Which is awesome, but is now no longer legal. Now you would look at this failed charge on 2d6 and you would say, I am either rerolling this one dice or I'm rerolling both dice, and that is it. That's the end of it. If you reroll one dice and then fail it, you cannot reroll anything else because that's not what you declared. Simultaneously,
and just to tie this back in a little bit, that does mean don't get ahead of yourself and just reroll a single die and then, oh crap, I should have done blah 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 blah. Stop, take your time, and assess what is the probability of me getting the outcome I want. And that could be if you have a dice pool with 20 dice in it, you have the option to reroll hit rolls from like the Chapter Master tactics, stuff like that. There's different things where rerolling one might be relevant, or rerolling two or three, just depending. So don't get ahead of yourself and just pick up a die and roll it just to roll it. Make sure you're making that decision and making the best decision.
Another case where this matters is that if you have an Imperial reroll factory for saves, for example, we have often seen people have, a Smash Captain and they have, or a Shield Captain, and they have a Victor of the Blood Games, which gives you a reroll, and they have Grand Strategist, which gives you a reroll, and they have a command point for a reroll. If I make you fail saves, you then have to decide how many you're rerolling, and you have to spend all of that at once. So in the past, and again, this was perfectly viable at the time, I have had people have a Smash Captain with one wound left fail 2 saves, and they command point the first one and pass it. And then they're like, well, now I'll Grand Strategist the second one to see if I pass that as well. And then they do, and the Smash Captain's alive. Now you'd have to dedicate both rerolls at once to rerolling both dice simultaneously. So, just something to keep aware of and keep your opponents honest about. It's not a massive game-shaking change, but it will affect a couple strategies that higher-end players would use. Secondly, if you have any scenario where you are rolling off with your opponent, you will both decide after the initial dice roll whether or not you're re-rolling. So, for example, if I have Mental Onslaught and I roll a 1, my opponent rolls a 3, we will both look at that, both decide if we are re-rolling, and decide that before we re-roll anything.
And I could see that leading to an argument. I would probably say the active player Well, I don't know. Would the active player declare the intent to reroll first, or would that be the responsibility of the non-active player? Because like, if let's say you mental onslaught me, who has to say they want to reroll first? Because there's going to be a success and a failure based off of that roll.
So
you see what I mean?
You have to do it at the same time. And my thought for doing this honestly is I'm going to take a dice in my hand and I'm going to set it behind a building, and I'm going to say, if this dice is a 4, I intend to re-roll it. And I'll have my opponent do the same thing. I'll put it behind a cup, I'll hold a piece of paper over it, I will do something to that effect, and that will be my way of declaring intent, and I will have them do the same thing, and then we'll both lift our paper, hand, or whatever the case may be, simultaneously.
Gotcha. That's going to be tricky. So one thing I was kind of thinking about is how you can kind of almost use this to your advantage. The example you're using of mental onslaught. Well, if you roll a 2 and I roll a 5, and that 5 succeeded, but I'm afraid you're going to reroll and get like a 3+, I might spend a reroll myself to fish for that 6 to guarantee you don't get it, or I think you're going to reroll and I'm going to fail anyway. And so I might reroll, get a 3 or a 4, fail, and you never had to do anything, and suddenly your failure turned to a success. So it does add a kind of another element, another mind game, which I think overall won't come up often, but will be a very valid thing to look out for in the future.
Yeah. I love mind games, and I love games within games, and just, meta games, all of it. So I am fully in favor of any opportunity to do that. Will it come up in the next 50 games? Once at most. But when it does, I will be very happy.
Absolutely. And kind of the whole competitive nature of a game is forcing your opponent to make as many decisions as possible, because then they have the opportunity of making more incorrect decisions. So it's just another kind of wrinkle that can lead to that.
Mm-hmm.
So another change that I wanted to talk about a little bit was savior protocols and weapons that deal mortal wounds. There is some confusion on this because, of course, an FAQ that's meant to clarify creates confusion. But basically, the summary is when it comes to the shock attack gun from the Orc Big Mech with shock attack gun, obviously. If he successfully hits and then successfully wounds, then you can pass off the mortal wounds, the damage, everything to a shield drone as a single mortal wound. However, if he fails to wound, then the target of that attack just takes the D3 mortal wounds. It's a little bit tricky. I don't want to go through all the phrasings and stuff of why it works that way. That's how it works. There's arguments all over the internet you can get into if you want.
And I will say that this is a little bit counterintuitive, because if you read the generic rulebook FAQ, it does look like it would go the opposite way. However, the Tau FAQ does give very clear examples, very specific examples of exactly how this works. So if you're confused on how that works, read the main rulebook FAQ and the Tau FAQ, and it, in my opinion, becomes pretty crystal clear.
Yep. And the big thing, if you read the shock attack gun or snipers or any weapon really, it says when you roll to hit, you get the result, blah, blah, blah. You do D3 mortals in addition to normal damage. So you're following through the entire attack sequence, and then at the end, you're dealing this in addition to normal damage. If the normal damage would be 0 because you didn't wound, that's why it doesn't transfer to the shield drone at that point. It's a little bit tricky. You'll figure it out. I have faith in you.
Yeah. It's a whole can of worms. It's weird and it's counterintuitive, but just go read the Tau FAQ and the main FAQ, and then it'll still not make any logical sense, but at least understand what the rule is. I think that was it for Clear as Mud. I think that was it for their the general game FAQs. There were a couple codex specific ones that do have relevance. I'll start off with Gene Stealer Cult. Gene Stealer Cult got 2. One of which was previewed at Nova. It was very much expected at this point. Basically, if you use Return to the Shadows, they came from below to pull 3 blips into reserve. You still have to come in on turns 2 or 3. Those are your only options. Coming in on turn 4 is not a viable option with that stratagem. So that's how the Gene Stealer Cult community expected it to be ruled after Nova, but up until that point, it was very much believed to be the other way. But now we know for sure. There's no more arguing it. We can move on. Secondly, the Kellermorph received a very small love tap of a nerf. Basically, he had an ability where if he killed a model, he gave an aura of reroll once to hit. Now, he cannot benefit from his own aura if he kills a model with his first shot and then rolls the next 5. So there's no longer a reason to slow dice the Kellermorph per se. You might as well roll all of the shots at once because he won't benefit from his own aura until after the shooting attack is resolved.
And I think they kind of clarified that throughout multiple books. I might be wrong. I might just have made that up, but I want to say I saw something or heard something like similar. If a unit of like Pathfinder shoots one marker light, gets the reroll ones, and then the other 4 roll, I don't think they get the reroll ones, but I might be completely screwing that up. So
you actually are completely screwing that one up. I'll call it out right now. That did not change in the Tau FAQ. As of right now, if you fire multiple marker lights, roll them one at a time. There's no reason for fast dice because that first one to hit will give the rest of the unit rerolls once. It's a little bit inconsistent, but from a Genestealer Cult perspective, it gives me a reason to fast dice where I didn't before, which is good because the army takes a while to play. So it's a quality of life improvement for Genestealer Cult, but a technical nerf even if most players did not even take the time for that small chance of mattering. So overall, it's not a serious nerf to Genestealer Cult at all. Both of the changes were, again, love taps of nerfs, but it's not the end of the world at all. Certainly, I'm more concerned about the release of the Impulsor kit whenever that comes out than I am this FAQ. The Flying Rhinos will be a big problem for Genestealer Cult. I think that's the worst part of the Space Marine book for Genestealer Cult specifically. But up until that point, I think they can still contend. With that said, I think Space Marines were the recipient of the only other significant FAQ. A lot of people got FAQs, to be clear. Space Marines, the Skittle chapters that aren't in the Codex, they all got Shock Attack and the profile changes from the Space Marine book added into their rules. However, those were kind of already there. You just had to find a PDF compilation of rules for Space Marine chapters. Now it has gotten added to each individual chapter FAQ, so that's mostly bookkeeping. But Space Marine's big changes, there are 2. One is that any 6 result to hit that generates additional hits no longer counts the additional hits as 6s as well. So this stops the incursors from rolling 1/6 to hit and then dealing 3 automatic wounds and 3 additional hit rolls, which can generate their own automatic wound rolls, which would generate 3 more, and you can basically infinite fucking time loop. Here are all of the 6s. Your knight got killed by a power armor dude. As long as you keep rolling 6s. So that is over. Now it's 1. It's that 1 dice generates the 1 extra roll, not it generates extra hits and then those hits generate extra wounds, which will then generate extra hits. They cut that off. They stopped the hyperloop. Incursors are still a fine unit. However, they're no longer just ridiculous amounts of vomiting dice because you roll a couple more 6s than average.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever played Magic the Gathering, but losing a game because of an infinite loop is one of the least satisfying ways to lose. So let Magic keep that and keep it out of 40K.
Let's keep our deodorant showers and lack of infinite loops. Thank you. And then finally they did nerf the Whirlwind Scorpius from Forge World. They also nerfed the Whirlwind Hyperios, but no one actually cares because that doesn't exist. The Whirlwind Scorpius has lost the keyword Whirlwind, which, while a little counterintuitive and makes no sense at all for what the keyword system was about, from a balance perspective it does make sense, because it means you can no longer put Sergeant Cronus in a Whirlwind Scorpius. This was, unfortunately, one of maybe 2 things that made Ultramarines remotely viable compared to other chapters, so at this point you can kind of just kiss your Smurfs goodbye. I think you're just going to be better off with other chapters. It also means that you can no longer use a stratagem to double shoot a Whirlwind Scorpius. So at this point, as far as I'm concerned, the Whirlwind Scorpius has no reason to exist. At 215 points, it's 6d3 shots. For 240 points, you get 6d3 shots on 3 platforms. So you get +1 strength, same damage, same number of shots, ignore line of sight, and triple the wounds for about 25 points more. There's just no reason to take Scorpius anymore when you have access to the normal Whirlwind. And then you start comparing the Whirlwind to the Thunderfire and realize that's where your points should be all along.
Yeah. Efficiency matters.
Efficiency matters. It was cool. Like, putting Cronus in a Scorpius was probably not broken. And, putting Cronus in a Scorpius was good, but not as broken as the 7 other combinations that you can look at, so no one really worried about it. So you're not going to see it, and that's all there is to it, because it no longer exists. And at that point, I don't think that there's any reason to take the Scorpius anymore, pending other supplements that can buff it. And finally, the FAQ was pretty brief, all things considered. There were no match play major changes, anything like that we were used to seeing. So this was obviously a lot shorter than the other ones. I am going to, however, discuss a ruling that was made by Frontline Gaming. This is not a Games Workshop ruling and should not be expected everywhere. However, if Frontline Gaming ruled it for SoCal, we can very much so expect them to rule it this way for the Las Vegas Open. And if it's being ruled for the Las Vegas Open, you can expect a lot of other events to play it this way. And it's a pretty good indication on how Games Workshop feels about the game usually. For the SoCal Open, Frontline Gaming has ruled that a vehicle with fly or monster, basically any non-infantry with fly, that is landing on top of a building or ruin or similar structure has to be able to put their entire base down. So there is no longer are you allowed to, for example, find a ruin and park a flying stem on it because it technically balances by slightly leaning against this wall. You now have to be able to place the entire base flat on the structure without any overlap. Not even leaning. It's if the toe of Magnus or Mortarion is hanging off of a rooftop, you are not allowed to put Magnus Mortarion there. This is a massive, massive nerf for flyers. And you can say, oh, there are plenty of magic boxes that are big enough that I can park my entire base on it. That is entirely possible. However, if I put a single infantry model in the center of literally any piece of terrain that exists in the game, you won't be able to balance the entire model on it. That means you won't be able to be placed on it at all. Now, for models that can fly and that are melee, I'm willing to bet that they're still going to follow up on their old ruling of if it has the distance to be placed somewhere but simply can't because of enemy model placement, then you'll still be able to just go at the bottom and still fight, kind of like the example of, I think it was a Dreadnought next to a crater, or Mortarion next to a cargo crate, with some guys on top, and they said, yes, Mortarion can go here, only their model placement prevents that, therefore you just kind of place him at the bottom, declare it that he had the distance to do so if he actually did, and you fight as normal. I imagine that part will stay. But the big thing is Eldar flyers that used to be able to be placed on ruins. This creates very large no-go zones for them of pretty much any piece of terrain, and you can exploit that very easily by now filling in other spots. So if you are attempting to crash Eldar flyers by filling up their eligible landing spots, there are now a lot more zones, and this goes for every flyer, of course. It really gives you a lot more options for combating fly units and for hiding from them. And I think that Cania generals will be able to use that to their advantage a lot. What this rewards, then, in my opinion, is infantry. Infantry become more valuable because less things can go into these areas. Therefore, the things that can gain value. So flying infantry, anything of that nature, especially small stuff that can, fit inside boxes, that's all great, and I think that's all just as good as before. But a fly nerf is a big deal, and I expect we'll see the Eldar flyer meta. If it wasn't already toning down due to the Space Marine release, I expect that at FLG events it'll become even smaller, which is wonderful because, no one likes the elves. And I think that's actually all we had for the night, so I'm going to go ahead and close this out here. What we're looking at for next week, or let's say the rest of the month, on October 12th and 13th, myself and Daniel will both be at Crucible, a major in Orlando, Florida. It's a fantastic event. I'm going in there trying to defend a title. We'll see if I can do it, but it's a great event run by a great crew. Awesome, beautiful terrain. I can't say enough about how smoothly it runs every year. So if you're in the South at all, you haven't been to Crucible, oh man, shoot me a message. I'll send you some pictures of what it looked like last year. It's honestly, it's my favorite singles event of the year. just because of, the people I get to hang out with, the terrain that I get to play on, how smoothly run it is. Like, we've never had any troubles with it. Starting late with there just being Planet Bowling Ball, Crucible is an absolute blast, and I'd recommend it to anyone who can make it to Orlando. After that, at the end of the month, I'll be going to SoCal. I don't think Daniel's going to be able to make that one, but okay. We mentioned car troubles before. I should be at SoCal unless my car costs way more than estimated to fix. And I should be joined by a couple of the Brohammer teammates. Myself, Ruben Fernandez, Mark Perry. I don't think Mark can make it, actually. But Richard Martin and Richard Siegler, I believe, will all be there. As well as Brohammer friend and associate, Aurelio Coria and Jim Vessel. And it should be an absolute great time. I'm sure that it'll be in the full kick at the Space Marine meta by then. Next episode, we are going to record one more time before Crucible. It'll be after the list submissions. Daniel and I will both talk about the list we're bringing, why we're taking them, and we're going to do a little segment on primary chapters versus successor chapters and when you should take each. I think that's going to be it. So if you guys have any feedback, if you guys enjoy the episodes, please like, comment, subscribe, all of the generic things that every YouTuber says. And come check us out next week. Have a good one.